And hello and welcome. My name is Martin, and today what we're going to be doing is creating our first enemy. This enemy is going to be what I like to consider a stationary mine. So we're going to be looking at the different things that we need to do to be able to create the situation that we need to be able to create a realistic effect for what a stationary mine would do in the real world. So we think what a mine does, usually when you come into contact with it or when it overlaps or blocks an event, it explodes, right? So we need to create a mesh that will then turn into an explosion sprite and then afterwards remove all remnants of itself from the game. So that in this case what we have to do is we have to create a blueprint. So this will be the first time that we use a blueprint in our project, and with that blueprint we'll be able to tell the mesh to do certain things after the mesh has been made contact with, which is what essentially a stationary mine does, as stated earlier. So in order to be able, and let me go ahead and show you what this actually looks like. So I've got 3 of these stationary mines there. I'm going to go ahead and push play, and let's one, and you can see that the object now, oops, I don't want to make them all explode. Okay, so the projectile made it explode. Me running into it made it explode, and I'll shoot the other one, and you can see the fireball, the smoke, and the sound of the explosion. Now all of those are sprites or blueprints that are already built in that we can actually spawn into existence. So the cube is literally transforming from a cube into this explosion sprite, and then everything of that is disappearing. Otherwise we would get something that would feel like an invisible wall. So once that object has exploded, we can then walk through the area without being blocked because there's not a remnants of something that's there. The other thing too is I like starting with this one because we don't need a navigation mesh for this. So the nice thing about a stationary mine is, since it doesn't need movability, we can say that it needs to be movable because it needs to change inside the game, but it doesn't need to actually move. So it doesn't need a navigation mesh. So it you can use these outside of a navigation mesh and still have the same effect. So interesting little thing there. So let's go ahead and see what we need to do to actually create one of these. Now, what you would think you would need to do would be to like grab a cube here, drop it on the floor, and then add a blueprint to it. And I suppose that you can do it that way. Let's do that. And yeah, I guess let's not do it that way. Let's do it the other way. The other way is better. Okay, so what we need to do first is, since we're actually going to be creating quite a few enemies, and we want to keep track of all the different files and folders and pieces of information that we're going to be using to construct these enemies, well, the best thing to do would be to create a folder. And so somewhere, go all the way back to your content folder, right click, and go to new folder. And let's call this enemies. Enemy, whatever you want. I like putting the A underscore in front, so then that, whoops, I can't have that in front. So then that way, again, it stays up there with like my stuff, so I can find it easier when I want to get back to the things that I've created or that I'm working on. So inside that folder, we want to double click. And we want to right click in the area again, and we want to create another folder. So let's go ahead and call this S mine for stationary mine. Also, when you're naming things, there's usually a rule of thumb that the first letter is capitalized and then the rest of the word is in lowercase. So if you were going to make additional words on this, mine, station. Okay, so we would have the first letter capitalized, then the rest of the word lowercase, first letter capitalized, rest of the word lowercase. It's just it makes things easier to read. If everything was uppercase or everything's lowercase, you don't know where the word it's actually start and end. But if you kind of have like that uppercase letter, it gives you a clue to make sure that you're reading that as a new word. Okay, so we have a folder, we're going to call it smine. I'll show you how to add more folders later. So let's go ahead and go into the smine. And in here, what we want to do is, we're done with folders, so let's go ahead and right click. And this time we're going to create a blueprint class, right? So the blueprint that we're going to be creating is called a pawn. And if we look up here underneath common classes, we actually have actor, pawn, character, right? So all of these are like different levels of things that can be done to certain meshes to get them to either move or be possessed by, and they mean possessed by that they are controlled by another component inside the game, like a pawn. You would expect a pawn to be controlled by, you know, the king. So those are things that receive AI and then do whatever the AI tells them to do. A character has, you know, the ability, in this case characters would be able to walk, jump, fly, swim. These would be better NPC-ish type feels. Actors are things that are going to be on the screen that need to interact with the player but aren't necessarily, let's say, a non-playable character or an enemy or something that would feel more like a person, right? So characters are reserved for things that feel, meshes that feel more like they need to do things that people would do. Pawns are things that are controlled by other characters or by AI. And then an actor is something that is in the viewing screen that the player needs to interact with, but doesn't necessarily have the characteristics of, let's say, a human being. So think of actors as objects. That's a better way of looking at it. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on pawn, since that's what we want to create. And let's call this pawn smine. Oops, I'm already breaking my rule. Okay, so smine. And once we've done that, we see that we have an icon that looks like a little pawn. And eventually that icon will actually transfer down to the bottom corner once we pick a mesh for this. So now that we have that there, let's go ahead and double click. And I'm going to close that one. All right, so when we open up, what we actually see is a ball, which is a representative of the default scene root, which is actually where the XYZ axis is going to show up. So what we need to do is we need to create a mesh here. So we're going to come up to the components panel up here in the top left hand corner. We're going to click on add component and add a cube, right? Now I pick cube. You can pick one of the other meshes that are in there. That's fine. I pick the cube because I like to show you that even after you've picked the cube, you can still come over here to static mesh, click on cube, and then go look for whatever asset that you want. So I actually like to use the barrel asset because I think I have this in one of the kits that I'm using. So the idea here is that this kind of looks like a thing of dynamite, or maybe, you know, I don't know. It's the best thing that I have that sort of gives me that type of that feel and appearance. All right, so I come up to the mesh, and if I have the mesh, I probably do have the material that goes with that mesh. So I'm going to type in here barrel. And I don't remember what the other one was called. Let's try barrel 2. That looks good. Okay. All right, so now we have the cube, or my bomb, that is going to look like a barrel of TNT, right? Something like that, like a cartoon style deal here. All right. Whoops, where am I flying around to? Okay, so now we have a mesh. So this is now going to be visible to the players on the screen because we have something to be able to grab and drop on the screen. Now the next thing we need to do is go to the tab over here that's called Event Graph. Now the Event Graph is going to be where we actually write our blueprints and where we're going to be writing in the code. So let's go ahead and click on these and let's hit delete because those are default events that are left in there. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to tell this thing that once we've simulated a hit event or an overlap event, we want something to happen in the blueprint. So in order to be able to do this, we need to select cube. Now we have to have cube selected because if we don't and we right click, we're going to see that Okay, so we're going to see that we don't get an option for that particular event. We can type in event, but it's not going to be tied into the cube. So if we click on cube and then right click, you'll see that we get these additional two options up here at the top. This first one is add event from cube, which is what we're looking for. We're trying to tag in something that's happening to the mesh to an event that we want to happen inside the blueprint, right? And then the other one would be functions. So functions are things like, let's look at some of these. Something is overlapping, there are reasons to use these, but right now we need to actually generate the event first. So if we look at these, everything up here is actually going to be events. So we can trigger an event based on a physics change. We can base an event based on a click on the keyboard or on the mouse, and we can base an event on something else touching the object, right, or touching the mesh. And in this case, that's what we're looking for. We want to add a component begin overlap. So this is the actual event that we're looking for, because what this is going to do is say basically the second that we overlap anything with this mesh, we want this event to take place. Now, the first step in this is that we actually need two things to happen. We want to turn the mesh into an explosion sprite, so we need to actually generate and spawn a blueprint that has both the fireball, the smoke ball, and the sound of the explosion. So that's already something that's given to you inside as a preset inside the game engine. So you're going to spawn, you're going to turn this thing into that, and then that thing, if you don't get rid of it, if you don't delete it, it will leave what feels like an invisible wall. So we have to turn that into a variable, so then that way we can then destroy the whole thing as an actor. From there, we then want to make sure that we don't have a remnants of the of any of the cube or any of the original cube left, because we want to make sure that we clean the code and that we don't have the ability for the code to somehow, for whatever reason, allow the cube to exist after the fact, or maybe allow the root scene to exist after the fact. So maybe the cube turns into this, but the root scene, for whatever reason, doesn't. And because of that, you end up with something that feels like an invisible wall. And we'll actually show you what this ends up looking like. So to create something that happens in sequence, first this, then this, what we need to do is drag out and type in the word sequence. You'll see that it's going to come in underneath flow control, and it's going to look like a bar, like a single bar that comes out and then does multiple things. So let's use that. All right, so from there we then see a new node that has then 1, then 2. So what's going to happen is once this event gets overlapped, it's going to go into this node and it's going to generate this event first, and it's going to wait for that to finish. And when that's finished, it will then play the next event. Now, if we want to, we need multiple events. We can keep adding new pins. And if for whatever reason we don't need those pins because we change our mind later, and we decide that we need less events, we can remove those pins. So you can add and remove pins, so more things that this thing can then do. All right, so off of the top pin, we need to pull out and then click and drag out. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to left click, drag out, and then it's going to open up an options box. And inside that options box, what we want to do is we want to type in spawn. Come on, fingers. Spawn actor from class. Now, I want to just draw attention up here to the top right-hand corner. Basically, what this does is it's a filter. And what this filter in essence does is when it's checked, it's going to give you options that make sense off of this, whatever it is that you're dragging off of. In this cases, from the event and also from the sequence, pretty much both of them are going to be pretty much the same, because it's whatever you want to do or what's available to do from there. But sometimes you drag off of something like this, and it's only going to give you a few options because it only makes sense to have a few options come off of that. So it's kind of nice to kind of like narrow down the field and say, okay, well, if you're dragging off of this pen and you're unsure what you want to do, at least these things kind of make sense for what you're dragging off of. So maybe this is sort of what you're looking for. If you wanted to be daring, you could do like this, and you'll see that the list expands and you get everything else that could possibly be an option. So if you leave it clicked, you're going to get less options. If you do this, you're going to get more options. But I like starting off with this because I want to see what makes sense if I'm unsure of what the next thing is that I want to do. But in this case, what we want is spawn actor from class. So we're filtering using typing in what we're looking for there. And we get this node now. Now you'll see that things are kind of color-coded, so events are going to be red, sequences or things that cause flow changes that direct first then this things will be like white. So you can color code and you'll get used to seeing the colors and understanding, oh, that means that something is happening, there's an event, and then this event's going to take place, and then this thing is a function of that event. This is something that's going to happen as a result of this event. All right, so the first option that we have is class. So go ahead and click on the downward arrow. Remember, downward arrows give us the ability to give us more options. And down here we're going to see a list of blueprints that have already been created for us. And we see one that is called Blueprint Effect Explosion. If we click on that, we then see that the name up here changes, so now it looks like what it needs to be. So it's going to spawn the actor blueprint, and it's going to be the effect explosion. From there, we need to tell it where it needs to generate this thing, because if we have a mine, we would expect the explosion to take place exactly where the mine is, not 5 feet away from it, not 10 feet away from it, not 100 feet away from it, but right where the thing is taking place. So what we need to do is get world transform. So we need to drag off of the spawn transformation, which is where it's going to take place, and we're going to say get world transformation. So what this is going to do is it's literally going to get where the cube transforms. So wherever the changing of the cube into the sprite takes place, it's going to look at where those coordinates are on the map and say this is where the sprite is also going to take place. So the cube is referencing the mesh that we have up here in the components panel. And so basically we're telling this, when the cube gets overlapped, the first thing we want you to do is generate this sprite. Where is this sprite going to generate? What sprite is it going to be? And where is that event going to take place? Right? So the other thing we can also talk about right now is kind of cleaning up your code a little bit. We know that we're going to have a second pin that's going to drag off of right here. So I want to actually leave a little bit of space for this. I like to kind of make my code a little bit more compact if I can. Like if I can kind of have it actually take a little bit less space, that's kind of good. All right. Now the other thing that you can also do with this before we move on is you can actually select the whole code, and if you have it all selected and you hit the letter C for cat or caret on your keyboard, it actually creates what's called a comments bubble around the outside. And now you can actually write in here and say that this is going to be S-mine explosion oops, I'm forgetting an O there. And the O is on the wrong side, sorry. Okay, so explosion, S-mine explosion code, or yeah, S-mine explosion. That's all we really need there. Now the nice thing about that is when you zoom out, you're going to get a nice big bubble. So if you've got a lot of code set up for a particular mesh or for a particular character, this is kind of nice. Now the other thing this also does is that if you click on this, you can then you should be able to click, and then you can drag the whole piece together, so you don't have to do this click and drag across to grab certain things. You can just grab the bubble and then move the bubble around. Okay, so a nice way to kind of organize that. Now, once you've made the bubble, obviously you might need to add more code to it, as we are about to, and so you may need to then move things around inside the bubble, so then that way you get more space. So even though you've created the bubble, there are ways to be able to move the bubble around, or the comments bubble around, and the contents inside the bubble around, so then that way you can generate more code, tidy it up, make it look nicer. All right. So the next thing that we need to do with this is, if this happens the way that it's happening right now, and we go in there and push play and drag one of these on the floor, what we're going to see is that we're actually going to get stopped by quite a few things. So actually, let me go ahead and name this something slightly different than just smine. Let's hit compile and save, and let's go out here, and let me actually rename this, because I already have these guys out here that are named that. So let me call this smine, or mine barrel, or maybe barrel mine, and maybe I'll just call it vmine. Okay, so if I grab one of these and drag it out on the floor, let's make it just a little bit bigger, and let me push play. So what should happen now is that I should, oops, collision settings are not set properly, so let's take a look at that. Let's go to the cube, scroll down to its collision settings. We do want it to create an overlap event. We need this to be custom. World dynamic is fine, and let it overlap with the pawn, and let it overlap with the projectile. So those are the two settings that we're going to need there to be able to make sure that the pawn actually creates the overlap event. So let's compile and save, and now let's push play. So it does explode, but the mesh is still there, right? And we keep having a thing generating the event. Now that might be cool. I mean, maybe that's something that you want to do. You know, you want this barrel that catches on fire every time something. I mean, that's a neat effect, but it doesn't really give us the effect of a stationary mine, right? So let us actually change that, so then that way it makes more sense. So let's go double click and let's go back into the code. So we'll go back into the blueprint, and what we need to do now is we need to turn this into a variable, so then that way we can actually destroy this as an actor. So if you were to click and drag off of the executive, you actually would not get what we're looking for. So what we need to do is click off of return value, drag out, click and drag out, and you'll see one of the very first options, or the second option from the top, is promote to variable. So if we click that, we now have a variable node, and underneath variables here in my blueprints, we now see that we have new variable -01, and up here that matches new variable -01. So if we want to rename this, so then that way it makes sense, so we can find it better, because we don't want a bunch of things called new variable 1, new variable 2, new variable 3, new variable 4. We want it to be useful and make sense when we look at it. So we click on the variable, we come over here to details, and scroll up to the very top, and I have the ability to be able to change the name. So let's go ahead and call this explosion. There we go again, explosion. Okay, so now we see that this is now called an explosion. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create an event from the variable. So when the variable is there, we can click on it, and if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we'll see a list of things that we could do with this variable now. One of the things would be on destroy. So let's go ahead and click the plus button for that, and we'll see that we get a tailored event set to the variable. So we see that the name of the variable is actually there. So when the event is when this event happens, destroy, right? So we're going to click out here and we're going to say destroy. Now there are two types of destroy. There is a destroy called destroy component, and then there's another one which would actually be the pieces of something. But since we don't have access to the pieces in the blueprint, I mean, I'm sure we do, but we don't have to. So that's why we're doing it this way, so we can just get rid of them as an actor and not have to individually go in and get rid of them piece by piece. So we're going to say destroy actor. Okay. Now from there, we do want to make sure that we connect the destroyed actor to the variable, to this function. And so now we have it. So what's going to happen is when the cube becomes overlapped, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to spawn into a explosion, and that explosion is going to spawn in the location that the cube transformed into the explosion, or where the cube is currently on the map. Once the explosion takes place and that's finished, it's going to turn itself into a variable, and that variable is going to then be destroyable through the actor. From there, we need one last thing, because as we saw, it didn't destroy the cube itself. So let's go ahead and click and drag down from here, and now what we want to do is click destroy. We want to destroy again. So let's type in destroy, but this time we want to destroy the components. We want to destroy these pieces that are left over. So let's grab cube, and we will now see that we have two things that are going to happen. The first thing is it's going to spawn into an actor where the cube was last. And once that's finished, those things are going to destroy themselves, and then it's going to destroy the cube, this object up here. That's what it's referencing, right? So for example, if I was to delete that and grab this and drag it back out, that would be the same thing. Now the other thing we also have is the default root scene. I like to go ahead and destroy this too, just to make sure that I have absolutely nothing left over, so we don't have weird effects that we're not looking for in what we consider a stationary mine. So once we have this built, let's go ahead and hit compile and save, and let's play this and see what happens now. Okay, and that's exactly what we're looking for. And if I walk over the area, we don't hear the audio from the explosion. We don't get any regeneration of the explosion effects, as we were seeing earlier. And our cube does indeed disappear. Get rid of those guys there. All right. So that's the stationary mine. Okay. So hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.